When a pregnant woman showed up at my front door claiming to be married to my husband of 12 years, I thought she was delusional. Then she pulled out a wedding certificate with his name on it, dated just 6 months ago, and I realized my entire marriage was a lie. I'm Georgia Wicks, and I never imagined I'd be sitting here telling you about the day my entire world collapsed in the span of 15 minutes. But that's exactly what happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon in Seattle, when everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man I'd loved for over a decade came crashing down around me. You see, I'd always prided myself on being observant, intuitive, the kind of person who could read between the lines and pick up on subtle changes in people's behavior. I was a marketing executive, for crying out loud. My job literally depended on understanding human psychology and recognizing patterns. I could spot a fake smile from across a conference room, detect when a client was lying about their budget, and sense when a colleague was plotting to undermine a project. But somehow, I'd been living with a complete stranger for 12 years and never suspected a thing. The morning it all unraveled started like any other Thursday in our comfortable Capitol Hill neighborhood. James had left for work at his usual time, 6:30 a.m. sharp, kissing me goodbye and promising to pick up groceries on his way home. He worked construction management for a company that specialized in commercial renovations, often traveling to job sites around the Pacific Northwest. The irregular schedule had never bothered me. In fact, I'd always appreciated having time to focus on my own career without feeling guilty about working late or traveling for business conferences. "I should be home by 7 tonight," he'd said, adjusting his hard hat and grabbing his thermos of coffee. "Unless the Portland project runs over again. You know how these clients can be." I'd nodded and wished him a good day, just like I had thousands of times before. James was reliable, steady, the kind of husband who remembered anniversaries and always called when he was going to be late. He brought me flowers for no reason, fixed things around the house before I even noticed they were broken, and still held my hand when we walked down the street together. We'd been trying to have children for 5 years without success, and the fertility treatments had been emotionally and financially draining. But James had been nothing but supportive through every disappointment, every failed cycle, every heartbreaking conversation about alternative options. "We'll figure it out together," he'd always say. "Whatever happens, we have each other." That Thursday afternoon, I was working from home, putting together a presentation for a major client meeting the following week. I'd been deep in concentration for hours when the doorbell rang around 3 o'clock. I almost ignored it. We lived in a busy neighborhood where delivery drivers, canvassers, and the occasional lost tourist frequently knocked on doors. But something made me get up from my desk and walk to the front window. Through the sheer curtains, I could see a young woman standing on our porch, shifting her weight from foot to foot like she was nervous. She was obviously pregnant, maybe 7 or 8 months along based on the size of her belly, and she kept looking at a piece of paper in her hand, then at our house number, like she was confirming she had the right address. My first thought was that she might be one of the neighborhood kids who'd grown up and moved away, coming back to visit old haunts. Or maybe she was looking for the previous owners of our house, not realizing they'd moved out over a decade ago. I opened the door with a friendly smile, ready to help with directions or provide contact information for whoever she was trying to find. "Hi," I said. "Can I help you?" The woman looked up at me, and I was struck by how young she seemed, probably late 20s, with long dark hair and tired eyes that suggested she hadn't been sleeping well. She was wearing a floral maternity dress and clutching what looked like official documents in her free hand. "Are you Georgia Wicks?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that I couldn't quite place. I felt a little flutter of unease. Very few people had our home address, and even fewer would show up unannounced. "Yes, I am. And you are?" My name is Autumn Hayes, she said, and then paused like she was gathering courage for what came next. I'm married to your husband. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. The words didn't make sense, like someone had spoken to me in a foreign language that sounded almost familiar but wasn't quite translatable. I'm sorry, what did you say? I said I'm married to your husband, to James Blair. James Blair. My husband's name was James Blair. That part was correct. But the rest of what she'd said was obviously some kind of misunderstanding or confusion. I think you might have the wrong person, I said gently, assuming she was dealing with some kind of mental health issue or pregnancy-related confusion. My husband is James Blair, but I'm his wife. We've been married for 12 years. Instead of looking embarrassed or apologetic, Autumn's expression hardened with determination. No, ma'am, I'm his wife. We got married 6 months ago in Portland. I have the certificate right here. She held up the papers she'd been clutching, and I could see official-looking seals and signatures even from where I stood in the doorway. That's impossible, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I felt something cold settling in my stomach. There has to be some mistake. James and I are married. We live here together. This is our house. I know this is his house, Autumn said, her voice getting stronger and more confident. He told me all about it, about how he used to live here with his ex-wife before their divorce was finalized. He said he was just staying here temporarily until he could figure out the property settlement. Ex-wife, divorce, property settlement. The words hit me like physical blows. What are you talking about? I whispered. Look, I didn't come here to cause trouble, Autumn continued, shifting her weight and placing a protective hand on her belly. I just need to talk to James about some things related to the baby, and he hasn't been answering his phone for 3 days. I know he's been stressed about the divorce proceedings and everything, but we need to discuss nursery furniture and insurance paperwork. I stared at this young woman, this pregnant stranger, who was talking about my husband like she knew intimate details about his life, our house, our marriage. She was speaking with the confidence of someone who had no doubt about what she was saying, but everything coming out of her mouth was completely insane. Can you show me that certificate? I asked, my voice barely audible. Autumn hesitated for a moment, then unfolded the documents and held them out for me to see. Even from a few feet away, I could make out the official seal of Multnomah County, Oregon, and in bold letters across the top, Certificate of Marriage. The bride's name was listed as Autumn Marie Hayes. The groom's name was James David Blair. James David Blair. My husband's full name, including the middle name that only appeared on official documents and that he rarely used in everyday life. This has to be a fake, I said, but my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. Ma'am, I understand this is confusing, Autumn said, and for the first time, her tone carried a note of sympathy. But I assure you, this marriage is completely legal and legitimate. James and I have been together for 2 years. We've been living together in Portland for 18 months. We're expecting our first child in 2 months. 2 years, 18 months, 2 months. The timeline was spinning in my head like a slot machine, trying to find some combination that made sense. Where do you think he is right now? I asked. At work, probably. He's a project manager for Cascade Construction Solutions in Portland. He's been working on a big office renovation downtown. Cascade Construction Solutions. Not the company he'd told me he worked for. Not the company that supposedly sent him on all those business trips to Portland and other cities throughout Oregon and Washington. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that I'd never noticed was there before. Everything solid and reliable in my world was suddenly shifting beneath my feet. I think, I said slowly, you and I need to sit down and have a very long conversation. Autumn nodded, relief flooding her face. I think so too. Because if what you're saying is true, if you really think you're married to James, then one of us has been lied to in a very serious way. As I stepped aside to let her into my house, into the home I'd shared with James for over a decade, I realized that both of us had been lied to in ways we were only beginning to understand. The woman standing in my living room wasn't my husband's mistress. She was his other wife. And if the marriage certificate in her hands was real, then everything I thought I knew about my life was about to be exposed as an elaborate, carefully constructed lie that had been 12 years in the making. The only question now was, which one of us was the legal wife, and which one of us was the victim of the most devastating con game imaginable? I was about to find out that the answer was far more complicated than either of us could have possibly imagined. To understand how I could have been so completely blind to my husband's deception, I need to take you back to the beginning, to the day I met James Blair and fell in love with what I now realize was a carefully crafted persona designed to capture my heart and keep me from asking too many questions. It was 13 years ago at a coffee shop in downtown Seattle called The Daily Grind. I was 22, fresh out of college with a marketing degree and working my first real job at a small advertising agency. James was 25, working construction and taking night classes in business management. He seemed older than his years, mature and responsible in a way that stood out among the guys my age who were still figuring out basic adulting skills. I'd been nursing a latte and working on a presentation when this ruggedly handsome man in work boots and a flannel shirt approached my table. "Excuse me," he'd said with a smile that made my stomach flip. "But are you using that outlet? My phone's about to die." It was such a simple interaction, but something about his confidence mixed with genuine politeness caught my attention. We started talking, and I found myself completely charmed by his quick wit and the way he listened, really listened, when I spoke about my work, my goals, my dreams of building a career in marketing. "You're going to be running your own agency someday," he'd said with such conviction that I almost believed it myself. "I can tell you're the kind of person who makes things happen." We talked for 3 hours that day. He told me about growing up in small-town Oregon, about losing his father in a logging accident when he was 16, about working construction to support his mother while finishing high school. He spoke about wanting to build something permanent, something that would last, whether it was buildings or relationships. "I'm not looking for casual," he'd said as we exchanged numbers. "I don't have time for games or drama. When I find the right person, I want to build a real life together." It was exactly what I wanted to hear at that stage of my life. I dated my share of immature guys who were allergic to commitment, and here was a man who talked about the future like he actually planned to be in it. Our courtship was like something out of a romantic movie. James would pick me up after work with flowers he'd bought from a street vendor, take me to little hole-in-the-wall restaurants he'd discovered during his lunch breaks, and spend hours walking with me through Pike Place Market or along the waterfront. He was attentive, without being clingy, romantic, without being cheesy, and he had this way of making me feel like the most fascinating woman in the world. "You light up when you talk about your work," he'd tell me. "It's one of the things I love most about you, your passion, your drive." 6 months after we met, he proposed during a weekend camping trip to the Olympic Peninsula. He'd planned everything perfectly, the sunset timing, the secluded beach location, even bringing a bottle of champagne hidden in his backpack. The ring was simple but beautiful, exactly what I would have chosen for myself. "Georgia Wicks," he'd said, dropping to one knee on the sand, "you make me want to be the best version of myself. Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life making you happy?" Of course I said yes. How could I not? He was everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. Kind, hardworking, devoted, and completely focused on building a life together. We were married 8 months later, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Seattle. James's mother, Patricia, had driven up from Oregon and seemed genuinely delighted to welcome me into their family. "He's never brought a girl home before," she confided during the reception. "You must be very special." Looking back now, I realize how little I actually knew about James's background, despite thinking we'd shared everything with each other. He'd been vague about his previous relationships, claiming he'd never found anyone worth getting serious about before me. When I asked about his friends from Oregon, he'd say most of them had scattered after high school, that he wasn't good at keeping in touch with people. "I'm more focused on the future than the past," he'd explain. "What matters is what we're building together." It seemed romantic at the time, this idea that our relationship was so consuming and perfect that nothing else mattered. But now I wonder if his reluctance to discuss his history was actually a carefully calculated way to avoid creating a backstory that might contradict his other life. The early years of our marriage were blissful. We bought our house in Capitol Hill, a charming 1920s bungalow with original hardwood floors and built-in bookcases that we spent weekends refinishing together. James threw himself into home improvement projects with the same dedication he brought to everything else, installing new kitchen cabinets, updating the electrical system, and creating a beautiful garden in our backyard. "This is our foundation," he'd say, surveying his latest project. "Everything we build from here is going to be solid and permanent." He was the perfect husband in so many ways. He remembered important dates, brought me coffee in bed on Saturday mornings, and never failed to tell me how proud he was of my professional accomplishments. When I got promoted to senior account manager, he surprised me with a weekend trip to Vancouver. When I landed my biggest client, he cooked my favorite dinner and bought a bottle of expensive wine to celebrate. "You're going to be VP before you're 30, he'd predict, and his confidence in me made me work even harder to prove him right. James's work schedule became more demanding as his company expanded into larger projects throughout the Pacific Northwest. He'd often be gone for several days at a time, managing construction sites in Portland, Spokane, or Tacoma. The travel bothered me sometimes, especially as we started trying to have children, but he always called every night and came home with stories about difficult clients or construction delays that explained any communication gaps. "The cell service is terrible at some of these job sites," he'd apologize when I couldn't reach him during the day. "But you know I'd rather be home with you than dealing with these contractors who don't know a foundation from a frame." When the fertility struggles began, James was incredibly supportive. He held me while I cried after every negative pregnancy test, researched treatment options late into the night, and never once made me feel like our inability to conceive was somehow my fault. "We have time," he'd remind me during the darkest moments. "And if this doesn't work out, we'll figure out other options. The important thing is that we're in this together." He came to every doctor's appointment, every consultation with fertility specialists, every procedure that required a support person. He held my hand during uncomfortable tests and procedures, brought me ice cream after particularly difficult days, and maintained an optimistic outlook even when I was ready to give up. "Maybe we're meant to be one of those couples who focuses on each other," he'd say during our worst moments. "Maybe our love story is about building something different than what everyone else has." The failed fertility treatments created a cocoon around our marriage that made us even more focused on each other and less connected to outside relationships. We stopped socializing as much with friends who were having children, partly because it was too painful, and partly because James seemed to prefer our quiet evenings at home. "I get enough people contact at work," he'd say when I suggested having friends over for dinner. "When I come home, I just want to relax with my wife." His reluctance to socialize had seemed sweet at the time, evidence of how much he valued our relationship and our private time together. But now I'm wondering if it was actually a strategy to minimize the chances of our social circles intersecting with whatever life he was living in Portland. James was also remarkably private about his work, relationships. He never suggested I attend company parties or holiday events, claiming they were boring affairs that spouses typically skipped. When I asked about his coworkers, he'd give generic descriptions of people I never met or interacted with in any meaningful way. Construction guys aren't really into the whole bring your wife to work thing, he'd explain. It's a pretty male-dominated industry, and most of the social stuff happens at bars after work, not exactly your scene. Even his financial contributions to our household were handled in a way that, looking back, seems designed to avoid creating paper trails that might reveal inconsistencies. He'd often pay for things in cash, claiming he preferred not to use credit cards for personal expenses. When we bought the house, he'd handled most of the financial paperwork, saying he wanted to spare me the headache of dealing with mortgage brokers and title companies. "You're busy enough with your career," he'd said. "Let me take care of the boring financial stuff." I'd been grateful for his willingness to handle the administrative aspects of our life together, but now I realize it also meant I had very little insight into his actual income, his banking relationships, or how he was able to afford his share of our lifestyle on a construction worker's salary. The most telling detail, in retrospect, was how he handled his phone and computer usage. James was always protective of his devices, never leaving them unattended and always keeping them password protected. When I'd tease him about being paranoid, he'd laugh it off as a habit from working in construction sites where tools and equipment got stolen regularly. "You can't be too careful these days," he'd say. "Identity theft is everywhere." It seemed reasonable at the time, but now I understand it was probably the most crucial element of maintaining his double life. His phone and computer were the only places where evidence of his other existence might surface, so he had to maintain absolute control over access to them. All of these red flags seem so obvious now, but when you're living inside a loving relationship with someone who seems completely devoted to you, it's easy to rationalize away small inconsistencies or peculiar habits. I trusted James completely because he'd never given me any reason not to trust him, at least not any reason I was able to recognize at the time. But as Autumn and I sat in my living room that Thursday afternoon, comparing notes about the man we'd both married, I was about to discover that every assumption I'd made about my husband, my marriage, and my life had been built on a foundation of lies so elaborate and systematic that it would take months to fully unravel them. The man I'd loved for 13 years didn't exist. He was a character James had created to seduce me, marry me, and keep me satisfied while he built an entirely separate life with another woman in another city. And I was about to learn that Autumn and I weren't his only victims. We were just the beginning of a pattern of deception that was far more extensive and disturbing than either of us could have imagined. The first crack in my perfect marriage appeared 3 months before Autumn showed up at my door. But at the time, I dismissed it as nothing more than the kind of small irritation that happens in any long-term relationship. I was doing laundry on a Sunday morning when I found a receipt in James's jeans pocket for a jewelry store I'd never heard of. Bella Vista Fine Jewelry in Portland. The purchase was for over $800, dated the previous Wednesday, when James had been on what he called a routine site inspection for his company. My first reaction was excitement. Our 12th wedding anniversary was coming up in 2 months, and I assumed he'd bought me something special during his business trip. The amount seemed extravagant for our usual gift-giving budget, but maybe he was planning something particularly romantic to mark 12 years of marriage. But as weeks passed and our anniversary approached, I found myself wondering what he could have possibly bought that cost so much. James usually gave thoughtful but modest gifts. A nice bottle of wine, a book by my favorite author, flowers from the farmer's market. $800 was completely out of character for him. "Honey," I said one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. "I accidentally saw a receipt from a jewelry store in Portland. Are you planning something elaborate for our anniversary?" The look that flashed across his face lasted maybe half a second, but it was long enough for me to notice it was panic, not the sheepish embarrassment of someone whose surprise had been discovered. "Oh, that," he said, turning back to the dishes with studied casualness. "That wasn't for you. One of the guys at work asked me to pick up something for his wife while I was in Portland. He transferred me the money, but I haven't had a chance to give him the jewelry yet." It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, but something about the way he delivered it felt rehearsed, like he'd been preparing for this conversation. "That's sweet of you to help out," I said, watching his body language carefully. "Which coworker was it?" "Danny Peterson. You don't know him. He's new to the crew. His wife has some specific jewelry she likes that they only sell in Portland." Danny Peterson. I filed the name away in my mind, though I couldn't say why. James had mentioned dozens of coworkers over the years, and I rarely remembered their names since I never met any of them. Our anniversary came and went with James giving me a beautiful but modestly priced necklace from a local Seattle boutique. He never mentioned the expensive Portland jewelry again, and neither did I. But something about the whole interaction left me feeling unsettled in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The second incident happened a month later, and this time I couldn't dismiss it as easily. I was working late at my home office when James's phone started buzzing on the kitchen counter. He was in the shower, and the phone kept ringing and ringing with a persistence that suggested an emergency. Finally, worried that it might be his mother or some kind of work crisis, I picked it up to see if I should interrupt his shower. The caller ID showed A. Hayes with a Portland area code. A. Hayes. Autumn Hayes, though I didn't know her name at the time. The phone stopped ringing just as I was debating whether to answer it, but 30 seconds later, a text message appeared on the lock screen. "Baby's kicking like crazy tonight. I think he's going to be a soccer player like his daddy. Miss you. Can't wait for you to come home tomorrow." I stared at that message for a full minute, reading it over and over again, trying to make it make sense in the context of my marriage. Baby's kicking. His daddy. Come home tomorrow. James emerged from the bathroom in his robe, hair still damp, and found me standing in the kitchen holding his phone with what must have been a very strange expression on my face. "Everything okay?" he asked, and I caught that same flash of panic I'd seen during the jewelry store conversation. "Your phone was ringing," I said slowly. "Someone named A. Hayes from Portland. They sent a text message about a baby." For just a moment, James looked like a deer caught in headlights. Then his expression shifted to confusion and mild annoyance. "Oh, that's probably Amy Hayes from the Portland project," he said, taking the phone from my hands. "She's the project coordinator for the client. Must be some kind of inside joke about the project timeline or something. You know how construction guys are with their metaphors." He glanced at the message quickly, then deleted it without showing me the full text. "Yeah, that's definitely work stuff," he confirmed. "Amy's always making jokes about projects being her babies and how they're developing. Kind of weird, but some people are like that about their work." Again, it was a plausible explanation delivered with just enough confidence to make me feel foolish for questioning it. But the message hadn't sounded like workplace banter. It had sounded intimate, personal, loving. "I didn't realize you worked that closely with project coordinators," I said. "Usually I don't, but this Portland job is complicated. Lots of moving parts, lots of communication needed." He was already walking toward the bedroom, signaling that the conversation was over. I should probably call her back and clarify whatever she meant by that message. He took his phone into the bedroom and closed the door, something he'd never done before during a work call. I heard him talking in low tones for about 10 minutes, but I couldn't make out any specific words. When he came back out, he was smiling and relaxed again. "All sorted out," he announced. Miscommunication about project deadlines. Amy's got a weird sense of humor, but she's good at her job. That night, I lay awake long after James had fallen asleep, replaying the text message in my mind. Miss you. Can't wait for you to come home tomorrow. How could that possibly be work-related? And why had he seemed so rattled when I mentioned it? But James had been so convincing, so matter-of-fact about the explanation, that I eventually convinced myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the message really had been some kind of office joke that I didn't understand. Maybe I was reading too much into his momentary confusion. The third incident happened 2 weeks later and shattered any remaining benefit of the doubt I'd been giving him. I was supposed to attend a client dinner that Thursday evening, but the meeting got canceled at the last minute due to a family emergency on the client's side. Instead of calling James to let him know I'd be home early, I decided to surprise him with takeout from his favorite Thai restaurant. I got home around 6:30, expecting to find him watching television or working on one of his household projects. Instead, I found an empty house and a note on the kitchen counter. Got called away for emergency site inspection in Tacoma. Be back late tomorrow night. Love you. It was exactly the kind of note James had left dozens of times over the years during unexpected work trips. Nothing unusual about it, except for one thing. James's truck was still in our driveway. I stood at the kitchen window, staring at his pickup truck and trying to make sense of the situation. If he'd been called away for an emergency work trip, how had he gotten to the job site? Had someone picked him up? Had he taken a company vehicle? I called his cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Hey, honey, just got home and saw your note, I said after the beep. Hope everything's okay with the emergency situation. Call me when you get a chance. Love you. He didn't call back that evening, and when I tried again the next morning, his phone was still going to voicemail. By Thursday afternoon, I was genuinely worried. James never went this long without returning calls, especially when he was traveling for work. I started imagining accidents on construction sites, medical emergencies, all the terrible things that could happen to someone in a dangerous profession. Finally, around 3 o'clock, I decided to call his company directly to check on his whereabouts. Hi, this is Georgia Blair, I told the receptionist at Northwest Construction Management, the company James had told me he worked for. I'm trying to reach my husband, James Blair. He's supposed to be on an emergency job in Tacoma, but I haven't been able to reach him and I'm getting worried. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Ma'am, I'm not showing any employee named James Blair in our system, the receptionist said. Are you sure you have the right company? My stomach dropped. He's been working there for over 10 years. He's a project manager. Maybe he's listed under a different name or department. Let me transfer you to HR, she said, and I spent the next 15 minutes being transferred from person to person, each one confirming the same thing. Northwest Construction Management had never employed anyone named James Blair. I hung up the phone with shaking hands and immediately called 2 other construction companies in the Seattle area, thinking maybe I'd misremembered where James worked. Same result, no record of him at either company. That evening, I sat in our living room staring at James's empty truck in the driveway and facing the impossible reality that my husband of 12 years had been lying to me about the most basic facts of his professional life. If he didn't work for Northwest Construction Management, where did he go every day? If he wasn't traveling to job sites in Tacoma and Portland and Spokane, where was he spending all those nights away from home? And if he wasn't where he said he was, who was A. Hayes, and why was she sending him text messages about babies and missing him and wanting him to come home? James finally returned Friday evening, appearing in our kitchen around 7 o'clock as if nothing unusual had happened. He was carrying his overnight bag and wearing the same work clothes he'd had on when he supposedly left for the emergency trip. Hey, beautiful, he said. kissing my cheek and dropping his bag by the door. Sorry I couldn't call back yesterday. The cell coverage in that part of Tacoma is absolutely terrible, and we were working around the clock to fix a foundation problem. I stood there looking at him, this man I'd loved and trusted for over a decade, and realized I had no idea who he actually was. How was the job site? I asked carefully. Nightmare, he said, opening the refrigerator and grabbing a beer. Client had a water main break that compromised the whole foundation. We had to bring in emergency crews, work through the night, but we got it sorted out. He looked relaxed, confident, completely comfortable with his story. If I hadn't called his supposed employer, I would have believed every word. That sounds stressful, I said. I actually tried to call your office yesterday to see if they had any updates on when you might be back. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, James looked directly at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my blood run cold. Fear. You called my office? He asked, his voice carefully controlled. I was worried when I couldn't reach you, but the strange thing is, they said they don't have any employee named James Blair. The silence that followed lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. I watched James's face cycle through several expressions: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like calculation. That's weird, he said finally. I mean, I work through a subcontracting company, not directly for Northwest. Maybe that's why their main office doesn't have my information. What's the name of the subcontracting company? Pacific Northwest Solutions, he said without hesitation. We handle the specialized foundation work that Northwest contracts out. Another company name to check. Another layer of lies to unravel. I'm sure it's just a paperwork issue, James continued, moving closer and putting his arms around me. You know how these big companies are with their record keeping. But as he held me, I felt like I was embracing a stranger. Every kiss, every "I love you," every intimate moment we'd shared suddenly felt contaminated by the growing certainty that nothing about our relationship was what I'd believed it to be. That night, after James fell asleep, I lay awake planning my next moves. I was going to call Pacific Northwest Solutions. I was going to figure out who A. Hayes was. I was going to find out where my husband really went when he left our house. I had no idea that within 2 weeks, all my questions would be answered in the most devastating way possible. When the woman who'd been sending those text messages would show up at my front door and reveal that my marriage was not just built on lies, it was completely illegal. My husband wasn't just cheating on me, he was married to both of us, and I was about to discover that we weren't even his only victims. The morning after James returned from his mysterious Tacoma trip, I made a decision that would change the course of my life forever. I was going to find out who my husband really was, even if it destroyed everything I thought I knew about our marriage. I waited until James left for work, at his usual 6:30 departure time, then immediately called in sick to my own job. For the first time in my professional career, I was prioritizing personal drama over work responsibilities, but I knew I wouldn't be able to concentrate on marketing campaigns and client presentations while my marriage was potentially collapsing around me. My first call was to Pacific Northwest Solutions, the subcontracting company James had mentioned as his actual employer. I dialed the number with shaking hands, half hoping they would confirm his employment and restore some semblance of normalcy to my world. Pacific Northwest Solutions, this is Jennifer, a cheerful voice answered. Hi, Jennifer. I'm trying to verify employment for my husband, James Blair. He says he works for your company as a project manager specializing in foundation work. There was a pause, the sound of typing, and then, I'm sorry, ma'am. But we don't have any employee by that name. Are you sure you have the right company?" The words hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd been expecting them. "Could you double-check? Maybe he's listed under a different first name, or maybe he's a recent hire." "I've been with this company for 8 years, and I handle all our employment records," Jennifer said kindly. "We're a small operation, only 12 employees total. I can tell you with certainty that we've never had anyone named James Blair working here." I thanked her and hung up, then spent the next hour calling every construction company in the Seattle-Portland corridor. The results were always the same: no James Blair, no record of employment, no one who'd ever heard of him. By 10 o'clock that morning, I had confirmed beyond any doubt that my husband's entire professional life was a fabrication. He wasn't a construction worker, wasn't a project manager, and definitely wasn't traveling to job sites throughout the Pacific Northwest. So where was he going every day when he left our house? And how was he earning the money that contributed to our household expenses? That's when I decided to do something I never thought I'd be capable of. I hired a private investigator. I found Detective Rachel Martinez through an online search for Infidelity Investigations Seattle. Her website was professional and discreet, specializing in cases involving matrimonial concerns and background verification. When I called her office, she was able to meet with me that same afternoon. Rachel's office was in a nondescript building in the University District, and she herself was nothing like what I'd expected from a private investigator. She was probably my age, professionally dressed, with kind eyes and a manner that immediately put me at ease. "Tell me what's been happening," she said, settling behind her desk with a notepad. I told her everything: the jewelry receipt, the text message from A. Hayes, the fake employment, James's mysterious overnight trips. As I spoke, Rachel took notes and asked clarifying questions that made me realize how many details I'd been overlooking or rationalizing away. "How long have these red flags been occurring?" she asked. "The obvious ones started about 3 months ago, but now that I'm really thinking about it, there have been smaller inconsistencies for years. I just always had explanations for them." "That's very common," Rachel said. "Most people want to trust their partners, so they give them the benefit of the doubt even when evidence suggests they shouldn't." She explained her process: surveillance, background checks, financial investigations, and, if necessary, following James to determine where he actually went during his supposed work trips. "I have to ask you this," Rachel said gently. "Are you prepared for whatever we might discover? Sometimes the truth is more complicated than simple infidelity." I thought about that question for a long moment. Was I prepared to learn that my husband was cheating? That our marriage was a sham? That the man I'd loved for 13 years was a complete stranger? "I need to know," I said finally. "Whatever it is, I need to know the truth." Rachel's investigation began immediately. She started with basic background verification, checking James's social security number, employment history, and financial records. What she found in just the first week was more disturbing than anything I'd imagined. "Georgia," she said when she called me with her preliminary findings, "we need to meet. What I've discovered is going to be difficult to hear." We met at a coffee shop downtown, far from my neighborhood and anywhere James might unexpectedly appear. Rachel had a thick folder with her, and the expression on her face told me that whatever was inside was going to shatter my world. "Let's start with the basics," she said, opening the folder. "James Blair does exist. His social security number is legitimate, his birth certificate is real, but his employment history is completely fabricated." She pulled out a timeline she'd created. According to official records, James has never worked for any construction company in Washington or Oregon. In fact, he's never been employed in the construction industry at all. Then what does he do for work? That's where it gets complicated, Rachel said. Based on financial records and surveillance, it appears that James is running some kind of long-term con game. He's not just lying to you about his job, he's created an entirely false identity. She pulled out photographs taken during her surveillance of James over the previous week. The first few showed him leaving our house in his usual work clothes, but instead of driving to a construction site, he'd driven to a parking garage downtown where he'd changed clothes and gotten into a different car. "This is him leaving the parking garage," Rachel said, showing me a photo of James in a business suit, driving a silver sedan I'd never seen before. He drove this car to Portland, Oregon, where he spent 3 days at an address in a residential neighborhood. My hands were shaking as I looked at the photos. "What's at that address?" "A house, registered to James David Blair and Autumn Marie Hayes." Rachel's voice was gentle but firm. "Georgia, your husband appears to be married to someone else." The words hit me like a physical blow. Married to someone else. Bigamy. My 13-year marriage wasn't just built on lies. It was completely illegal. "That's impossible," I whispered, even though I knew it wasn't impossible at all. It was the only explanation that made sense of everything that had been happening. "I'm sorry, but there's more," Rachel continued. "The house in Portland is registered under James's name, and according to neighbors I spoke with, he and Autumn have been living there as husband and wife for almost 2 years. She's currently pregnant." Pregnant. The text message about the baby kicking, about missing Daddy, about wanting him to come home. It all made horrible, devastating sense. "Do you have any evidence of their marriage?" I asked. Rachel pulled out a copy of a marriage certificate from Multnomah County, Oregon. James David Blair and Autumn Marie Hayes, married 18 months ago. I stared at the document, trying to process what this meant for my own marriage, my own legal status, my entire life. If he married her in Oregon 18 months ago, and he's been married to me for 12 years in Washington, then one of these marriages has to be illegal, I said. "Actually," Rachel said carefully, "both marriages might be legal in their respective states, which would make James guilty of bigamy, a felony in both Washington and Oregon." "How is that possible? Don't they check for existing marriages before issuing new licenses?" "The system isn't foolproof, especially when someone is deliberately trying to circumvent it. If James used slightly different information on the applications, or if he got married in different states with different record-keeping systems, it's possible for someone to slip through the cracks." I felt like I was drowning in information that didn't make sense. But how has he been maintaining 2 separate lives? How does he afford 2 households? How has he kept us from finding out about each other? "That's what I've been investigating," Rachel said. "And what I've found suggests that James is more sophisticated than a typical cheating husband. This appears to be a carefully planned, long-term deception involving multiple identities and financial schemes." She pulled out bank records and financial documents that painted a picture of elaborate financial manipulation. James had been using different names and Social Security variations to obtain credit cards, bank accounts, and even employment under false identities. "He's not just married to 2 women," Rachel explained. "He's living as 2 completely different people. In Seattle, he's James Blair, the construction worker. In Portland, he's James Blair, the business consultant. Different jobs, different financial institutions, different social circles." "How long has this been going on?" "Based on what I've been able to trace, the Portland identity started about 3 years ago, but there are indications that he might have other identities in other cities as well." "Other identities, other cities, other women." "How many wives do you think he has?" I asked, afraid to hear the answer. "I don't know yet, but I'm working on finding out. What I can tell you is that this level of systematic deception suggests someone who's been doing this for a long time and has probably done it before." I sat in that coffee shop, looking at photographs of my husband living a completely different life with another woman, and realized that everything I thought I knew about love, marriage, and trust had been built on quicksand. "What do I do now?" I asked. "That depends on what you want to accomplish," Rachel said. "Do you want to confront him? Do you want to contact the other woman? Do you want to involve law enforcement?" "I don't know," I admitted. "I don't know anything anymore." "Can I make a suggestion?" Rachel said. "Don't confront James yet. Let me finish the investigation. If we're going to involve police or lawyers, we need to have all the evidence compiled properly. And if there are other victims, they deserve to know what's happening too." Other victims. The phrase made me realize that I wasn't just a betrayed wife. I was the victim of a crime. James wasn't just cheating. He was systematically defrauding multiple women and potentially destroying multiple families. "How long do you need?" I asked. "Give me 2 more weeks. I want to trace his financial activities, see if there are other properties or identities, and try to contact Autumn Hayes to see if she's willing to cooperate with the investigation." 2 more weeks of living with a man who had been lying to me for years. 2 more weeks of pretending our marriage was real while knowing it was built on systematic deception. But Rachel was right. We needed all the evidence before taking any action. If James was going to face consequences for what he'd done, we needed to build an airtight case. "Okay," I said, 2 more weeks. But I want to know everything, every lie, every identity, every victim. I want to know exactly who I've been married to." As I drove home that afternoon, I realized that the woman who had walked into Rachel's office was gone forever. The trusting wife who made excuses for her husband's behavior, who believed his explanations even when they didn't make sense, who prioritized marital harmony over uncomfortable questions. That woman had died in a coffee shop in downtown Seattle. In her place was someone harder, smarter, more determined to uncover the truth, no matter how devastating it might be. I was no longer James's victim. I was his investigator. And in 2 weeks, I was going to bring his entire house of lies crashing down around him. The moment Autumn Hayes and I sat down in my living room and began comparing notes about our shared husband, the full scope of James's deception began to unravel like a sweater with a pulled thread. Every detail she shared revealed another layer of lies, another carefully constructed element of his double life that was far more elaborate than either of us had imagined. "He told me you were his ex-wife," Autumn said, her hands protectively cradling her pregnant belly. "He said you'd been divorced for 2 years, but that you were having trouble letting go of the relationship." "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though I was beginning to dread the answer. "He said you'd been calling him constantly, showing up at his workplace, refusing to accept that the marriage was over. He made it sound like you were kind of unstable." Unstable. My husband had painted me as his crazy ex-wife to explain away any inconsistencies in his story to Autumn. "What did he tell you about this house?" I asked, gesturing around our living room. "He said it was part of the divorce settlement, that you were supposed to sell it and split the proceeds, but you kept stalling because you didn't want to finalize things. He said he was letting you stay here temporarily until you found your own place." The audacity was breathtaking. James had turned our 12-year marriage into a sob story about a vindictive ex-wife who wouldn't let him move on with his life. "Autumn," I said gently, "James and I are still legally married. We've never been divorced. This is our house. We bought it together 8 years ago." Her face went pale. "That's impossible. I have a copy of your divorce decree. James showed it to me before we got married." "He showed you divorce papers?" Autumn nodded and pulled out her phone. "I took pictures of all the important documents. I wanted to make sure everything was legal before we had the wedding." She scrolled through her photos and showed me images of what appeared to be official divorce documents from King County, Washington. The paper showed a divorce between James David Blair and Georgia Marie Wicks, finalized 3 years ago. I stared at the documents on her phone screen. They looked completely legitimate. Official seals, court stamps, legal language. But they were also completely fabricated. "These are fake," I said quietly. "I've never been divorced. We've never even been separated." "But they look so real," Autumn whispered. "How could he fake something like this?" "I don't know, but my private investigator said James has been using multiple identities and false documents for years. He's apparently very good at creating fake paperwork." "Your private investigator?" Autumn looked surprised. "You hired someone to investigate him?" I told her about the strange incidents that had led me to hire Rachel Martinez, about the fake employment and the mysterious text messages, and the growing pile of evidence that James was living some kind of double life. "This is insane," Autumn said, shaking her head. "How long have you suspected something was wrong?" "Really suspected? Only about 3 months. But looking back, there were red flags for years that I just ignored or rationalized away." "What kind of red flags?" I told her about James's secretiveness with his phone and computer, his reluctance to socialize or attend work events, his vague answers about his background and his friends. As I spoke, I could see recognition dawning in Autumn's eyes. "Oh my God," she said. "He does the same things with me. He never lets me touch his phone, never talks about work colleagues, never brings me to any social events." "What does he tell you he does for work in Portland?" "Business consulting. He says he works with small companies to help them improve their operations and financial management. He travels a lot for client meetings." Business consulting. A completely different profession from the construction management he'd told me about. "Does he ever travel to Seattle for work?" I asked. "All the time. He says he has several major clients here. Sometimes he's gone for 3 or 4 days at a time." Autumn paused, the implication sinking in. "Those were the days he was here with you, weren't they?" I nodded. "And when he told me he was traveling to Portland for construction projects, he was actually going home to you." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us processing the systematic way James had been manipulating our lives and our schedules to maintain his dual existence. "Autumn," I said carefully, "how did you two meet?" "At a coffee shop in Portland about 2.5 years ago. I was grading papers. I'm an elementary school teacher. And he struck up a conversation. He seemed so mature and stable compared to the guys I usually dated. He told me he'd been married before, but that it had ended badly, and he was looking for someone who wanted to build a real life together." The parallels to my own story were chilling. The coffee shop meet-cute, the emphasis on stability and building something permanent, the vague references to a previous relationship that had ended badly. "Did he tell you he wanted children?" I asked. "That was one of the first things we talked about. He said his ex-wife had never wanted kids, and it was one of the reasons their marriage fell apart. He said he'd always dreamed of being a father." I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. James knew how desperately I wanted children, knew about our fertility struggles, knew how much every failed pregnancy attempt had devastated me. And he'd been telling another woman that I was the one who didn't want children. "Autumn, James and I have been trying to have children for 5 years. We've been through multiple rounds of fertility treatments. He's been with me at every doctor's appointment, every procedure, every heartbreaking moment when another attempt failed." Tears started streaming down Autumn's face. "He said that was one of the reasons he knew I was special, because I wanted the same things he wanted. He said he'd finally found someone who shared his dreams about having a family." "How long have you two been married?" 18 months. We had a small ceremony in Portland, just his mother and a few of my friends. He said he didn't have much family, and most of his friends from his previous life were associated with his ex-wife, so he wanted to start fresh. 18 months. James had married Autumn while still legally married to me, making him guilty of bigamy, a felony in both Washington and Oregon. "Did you sign a prenup or any other legal documents?" I asked. "No." He said he didn't believe in prenups because they showed a lack of faith in the relationship. He wanted everything to be shared equally between us. I thought about our own financial arrangements, how James had always insisted on keeping certain accounts separate, how he'd handled most of the paperwork when we bought our house. I was beginning to understand that he'd been compartmentalizing his finances to keep his two lives from intersecting. "Autumn, I need to ask you something difficult. How does James support you financially? What kind of lifestyle do you have together?" "He pays for everything. The house, the car, all our expenses. His consulting business is apparently very successful. We live comfortably, but not extravagantly." She paused. "Why?" "Because he's been contributing to our household expenses too. He pays half our mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything. Either his consulting business is incredibly lucrative or he's getting money from somewhere else." "Somewhere else like what?" "I don't know. Credit card fraud, identity theft, maybe other women he's conning. My private investigator thinks there might be additional victims." Autumn's eyes widened. "Other women? You think he's married to more than just us?" "It's possible. Someone who can create fake divorce documents and maintain two separate identities for years is probably capable of even more complex schemes." We were interrupted by the sound of a key in the front door. Both of us froze as we heard footsteps in the entryway. "Georgia?" James's voice called out. "I'm home early. The Portland meeting got canceled." Autumn and I looked at each other in panic. James was supposed to be at work until evening, but here he was, walking into a situation that would expose his entire double life. "Georgia?" His voice was getting closer. I made a split-second decision. Instead of hiding Autumn or trying to avoid the confrontation, I decided it was time for James to face both of his wives simultaneously. "We're in the living room," I called out. James appeared in the doorway, still wearing his work clothes, carrying his overnight bag, and clearly expecting to find me alone. When he saw Autumn sitting on our couch, his face went through a rapid series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and then pure terror. "What the hell?" he said, looking back and forth between us. "Hello, honey," I said, my voice artificially sweet. "I'd like you to meet Autumn Hayes, though I believe you two have already met." James stood frozen in the doorway, his overnight bag still in his hand, clearly trying to calculate his options. "James," Autumn said, her voice shaking. "What is going on? You told me you were divorced. You showed me papers." This is not what it looks like," James stammered, but his usual confidence was completely gone. "Really?" I stood up and faced him. "Because what it looks like is that you've been married to both of us simultaneously, which makes you a bigamist and a felon." "Georgia, you don't understand." "I understand perfectly," I interrupted. "You've been living two separate lives for years. You've been lying to both of us about everything: your job, your background, your other relationships. You created fake divorce documents to convince Autumn it was legal to marry you. And you made me believe Georgia was your crazy ex-wife who wouldn't leave you alone," Autumn added, getting to her feet despite her pregnancy. "You used both of us." James looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between us and toward the front door like he was considering making a run for it. "Look," he said, his voice taking on that familiar tone of manufactured sincerity. "I can explain everything. This whole situation got out of hand, but I never meant for anyone to get hurt." "Never meant for anyone to get hurt?" Autumn's voice was rising. "I'm 7 months pregnant with your child. I thought I was married to someone who loved me." "I do love you," James said desperately. "I love both of you. That's the problem. I couldn't choose, so I tried to find a way to have both relationships. The audacity of his statement left both of us speechless for a moment. You tried to have both relationships by committing fraud and bigamy, I said. You've been lying to us for years. James, Autumn said, tears streaming down her face. Is anything you told me true? Do you even want this baby? Of course I want the baby, he said, but his answer sounded hollow even to him. That's when I pulled out the folder I'd prepared, copies of all the evidence Rachel had gathered, documentation of his fake employment, financial records showing his multiple identities, surveillance photos of him changing clothes and cars. James David Blair, I said, you're guilty of bigamy, fraud, and identity theft. Both of our marriages are probably invalid. Both of our relationships have been built on lies, and you've financially defrauded both of us for years. I set the folder on the coffee table between us. My private investigator has been building a case against you for 2 weeks. Tomorrow morning, we're taking all of this evidence to the police. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, James looked truly afraid. You called the police? Not yet, Autumn said, finding her voice. But we're going to. What you've done to us is criminal, and you need to face consequences. James looked back and forth between the two women whose lives he'd been systematically destroying, and seemed to realize that his carefully constructed world of lies was collapsing around him. I can fix this, he said weakly. We can work something out. The only thing you can fix, I said, is by turning yourself in and making sure both of us have legal grounds for divorce and financial compensation for the fraud you've committed. And by staying away from our child, Autumn added. I don't want a criminal and a liar anywhere near my baby. James stood there for another moment, then dropped his overnight bag and walked out the front door without another word. We heard his truck start up in the driveway, and then he was gone, leaving behind 2 women who'd discovered they'd been sharing a husband neither of them had ever really known. Autumn and I looked at each other, both of us emotionally exhausted, but also strangely relieved. What happens now? She asked. Now, I said, we make sure he never does this to anyone else again. The man I'd loved for 13 years had never existed. But the woman I was becoming, stronger, smarter, and absolutely determined to seek justice, was just getting started. 6 months later, I was sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Portland, ironically the same chain where Autumn and James had first met, when my phone buzzed with a text message from my lawyer. Guilty verdict on all counts. James Blair sentenced to 4 years in federal prison plus restitution. Justice served. I set down my phone and looked across the table at Autumn, who was cradling her 3-month-old daughter, Emma, while trying to manage a cup of tea with her free hand. The transformation in both of us since that devastating Thursday afternoon when our worlds collided had been remarkable, but the journey to get here had been anything but easy. The first 48 hours after James fled our confrontation had been a whirlwind of police reports, lawyers, and the gradual revelation of just how extensive his criminal activities had been. Detective Rachel Martinez's investigation, combined with what Autumn and I were able to provide, painted a picture of systematic fraud that went far beyond simple bigamy. You're not going to believe what we found, Rachel had told us during our meeting at the police station the day after James disappeared. Your husband has been running this scheme in at least 4 different states. 4 different states. As devastating as it was to learn that Autumn and I weren't his only victims, there was something almost validating about discovering that we weren't alone in our victimization. Rachel spread out a map on the conference table, marked with pins representing different cities where James had established identities. Portland and Seattle were just his most recent operations. Before you two, there was Christine Morrison in Denver, Colorado, and before her, Lisa Patel in Phoenix, Arizona. Christine Morrison, Lisa Patel. 2 more women who'd fallen in love with James's carefully crafted personas, who'd built their lives around relationships that were completely fraudulent. "Are they still married to him too?" Autumn asked, bouncing baby Emma gently as she spoke. Lisa divorced him 3 years ago, but she had no idea about the other women. Christine's case is more complicated. She disappeared 2 years ago, and local police are now investigating whether James might have been involved in her disappearance. The possibility that James might be connected to a missing person case added a sinister dimension to his crimes that neither Autumn nor I had considered. We'd been focused on fraud and bigamy, but the idea that he might be capable of violence was terrifying. "What happened to Lisa?" I asked. "She's willing to testify. Apparently James drained her savings account and maxed out credit cards in her name before disappearing. She's been trying to rebuild her financial life ever since." Over the following weeks, as federal investigators built their case against James, the true scope of his criminal enterprise became clear. He'd been using sophisticated identity theft techniques to create false employment histories, fake business licenses, and fraudulent financial documents. The money he'd been using to support his multiple households had come from credit card fraud, bank loans obtained under false pretenses, and systematic theft from his victims' accounts. He's basically been running a one-man organized crime operation, the federal prosecutor explained to us during one of our meetings. This isn't just a case of a man who couldn't choose between 2 women. This is a pattern of predatory behavior designed to financially exploit vulnerable people. Vulnerable people. I'd never thought of myself as vulnerable, but I could see how James had identified and exploited specific weaknesses in each of his victims. My desire for stability and family had made me overlook inconsistencies in his stories. Autumn's youth and trust had made her accept his explanations without demanding proof. Lisa's financial generosity had made her an easy target for theft. The most shocking revelation came when investigators discovered that James had been planning to abandon both Autumn and me within the next year. They found evidence that he'd already begun establishing a new identity in Las Vegas, Nevada, complete with fake references and a fabricated work history. "You confronting him probably saved you both from even worse financial devastation," Rachel told us. "Based on what we found, he was planning to drain your accounts and disappear before Autumn's baby was born." The legal proceedings took months to resolve, complicated by the multi-state nature of James's crimes and the need to coordinate with federal authorities. During that time, Autumn and I developed an unlikely friendship built on our shared experience of betrayal and our determination to see justice done. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," Autumn told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "The way he never wanted me to visit him in Seattle, how he always paid for everything in cash, how he never introduced me to any of his friends or coworkers." "We both missed the signs because we wanted to believe in the relationships we thought we had," I replied. "James was very good at making us feel like we were getting everything we wanted from a partner." The psychological impact of discovering that our marriages were fraudulent was something neither of us had been prepared for. It wasn't just heartbreak. It was a complete dissolution of our ability to trust our own judgment about people and relationships. "I feel like I don't know how to date anyone new," Autumn confided. "How do I trust that someone is telling me the truth about basic things like their name or where they work?" I understood her fear completely. My own attempts at dating since the divorce was finalized had been disasters of paranoia and background checking. I'd hired investigators to verify the identities of 2 different men before agreeing to second dates. "Maybe we're both too damaged to have normal relationships now," I said during one particularly dark conversation. "Or maybe we're just smarter about protecting ourselves," Autumn replied. "Maybe what James did to us will make us better at recognizing when someone is being authentic versus when they're performing." The financial recovery process was almost as complicated as the legal proceedings. Both of our marriages were declared legally invalid due to the fraudulent circumstances, which meant that all jointly held assets had to be sorted out through the courts. The house that James and I had shared was sold, with the proceeds going toward restitution for his various victims. James had managed to steal or fraudulently obtain over $200,000 from his various schemes, money that had been used to maintain his multiple households and identities. Getting any of that money back required navigating a complex web of insurance claims, bank fraud investigations, and asset recovery procedures. The good news is that you're not responsible for any of the debts he created using your identities, my lawyer explained. The bad news is that recovering the money he stole is going to take years, if it happens at all. Autumn faced additional challenges as a single mother, trying to rebuild her life while caring for a newborn. The house she'd shared with James had to be sold as part of the asset recovery process, and she'd been forced to move back in with her parents in a small town outside Portland. Some days I look at Emma, and I'm grateful that James is out of our lives before she was old enough to be affected by his lies, she told me. Other days I'm terrified about raising a child whose father is a convicted felon. But perhaps the most important part of our recovery process was the decision we made to turn our experience into something that could help other people. Working with victim advocacy groups and law enforcement agencies, Autumn and I began speaking at seminars about romance fraud and financial abuse. The goal isn't to make people paranoid about relationships, I would tell audiences. The goal is to help people recognize the difference between normal privacy and deliberate secrecy, between someone who's genuinely committed to building a life with you and someone who's performing commitment to exploit you. Our story resonated with more people than we'd expected. During one presentation at a community center in Seattle, 3 different women approached us afterward to share their own experiences with partners who'd exhibited similar patterns of deception. "You probably saved me from making a huge mistake," one woman told us. "My boyfriend has been giving me the same kinds of explanations about why I can't meet his coworkers or visit his apartment. I thought I was being paranoid, but after hearing your story, I think I need to do some investigating." The validation that came from helping other people avoid similar victimization was healing in a way that nothing else had been. It transformed our experience from something that had happened to us into something we could use to protect others. James was ultimately sentenced to 4 years in federal prison on charges including mail fraud, identity theft, and bigamy. He was also ordered to pay restitution to all of his victims, though none of us expected to see much of that money given his lack of legitimate assets. 4 years doesn't seem like enough for the damage he did to so many lives, Autumn said when we heard the sentencing. "Maybe not," I replied. "But it's a felony conviction that will follow him for the rest of his life. And now there's a record of his pattern of behavior that will make it harder for him to victimize other people." The most surprising development came when we were contacted by Christine Morrison's family. Christine, the woman from Denver who had disappeared 2 years earlier, had been found living under an assumed name in Northern California. She'd fled when she discovered James's deception, but had been too terrified to contact authorities because she believed his threats about what would happen if she tried to expose him. "He told me he had connections with dangerous people," Christine explained during a phone call with Autumn and me. "He said if I ever tried to leave him or tell anyone about our relationship, he'd make sure I disappeared permanently." Learning that James had used intimidation and threats to control at least one of his victims added another layer of understanding to his criminal behavior. He wasn't just a con artist. He was someone willing to use fear and psychological abuse to maintain control over his victims. Christine's story also helped explain some of the more puzzling aspects of James's behavior with Autumn and me. His insistence on keeping our social circles separate, his reluctance to create paper trails, his careful management of information flow, all of these things had served to isolate us and make it harder for us to discover his deception. The scary thing is how good he was at reading people and figuring out exactly what they needed to hear, Christine said. He made each of us feel like we were getting exactly the relationship we'd always wanted. Today, as I sit in this Portland coffee shop watching Autumn navigate single motherhood with grace and determination, I'm struck by how much we've both grown from this experience. Yes, we were victimized by someone who exploited our trust and manipulated our emotions, but we also survived it, fought back, and turned our experience into something that could help protect other people. Autumn has started a blog about single parenting and financial recovery after fraud, which has gained a following among other women dealing with similar situations. I've returned to marketing, but now specialize in campaigns for nonprofit organizations that support fraud victims and domestic abuse survivors. Do you ever regret confronting him that day? Autumn asks me as we prepare to leave the coffee shop. Never, I answer without hesitation. Finding out the truth was devastating, but living in a lie was worse. At least now we know who we really are when we're not being manipulated by someone else. The lesson I've learned from this experience isn't that all men are liars or that relationships can't be trusted. The lesson is that love without honesty isn't love at all, it's performance. And that the most important relationship in my life is the one I have with myself, which means trusting my instincts, asking difficult questions, and never again accepting convenient explanations for behavior that doesn't make sense. James Blair, or whoever he really was underneath all those false identities, taught me something valuable despite himself. That I'm stronger than I knew, smarter than I gave myself credit for, and capable of surviving betrayals that once would have destroyed me. The woman who opened her front door to a pregnant stranger 6 months ago was someone who prioritized peace over truth and comfort over clarity. The woman sitting here today is someone who chooses difficult truths over beautiful lies every single time. And that transformation, painful as it was to achieve, has been worth everything I lost in the process. Sometimes the best thing that can happen to you is discovering that your entire life has been built on lies, because it forces you to build something new that's actually real. That's a foundation that no one can ever take away from you, not even the most sophisticated con artist in the world.